Hello, today is Wednesday, November 6th, and welcome to episode 382 of Fault Lines, the National Security Institute's podcast that gets you quickly up to speed 3 times a week on the national security and foreign policy debates shaking up America. I'm NSI Senior Fellow Morgan Vina, and I'm joined here today, this post-election morning, by NSI's Deputy Executive Director, Martha Miller, NSI Advisory Member, Lester Munson, and NSI Senior Fellow Amy Mitchell. Team, what an election night that was. Holy smokes. Former President Donald Trump is set to become the 47th president of the United States, defeating Kamala Harris in what can only be described as a landslide. He powered through the blue wall and dominated the swing states. And so now that we can look forward to President-elect Trump in January, we can also look forward to a Republican-controlled Senate. And while many of the races in the House of Representatives are still too close to call, Republicans may just be sweeping this election season with a trifecta. So now we can probably talk about the election results ad nauseum and why Trump won, why Republicans have made significant strides in Congress. But because we are a national security podcast, we're actually going to talk about the implications of the election results on foreign and defense policy. So to break it down and tell us what all of that means, Lester, let's start with you.
Morgan, amazing results last night. Perhaps the most striking thing is that Trump won the popular vote, which a Republican has not done for 20 years, or at least that's the projection as of airtime this morning, or the time we're recording it. So I think it is a big deal that Trump won. I think most importantly, it's a rejection of the Biden administration and its lack of achievements in a lot of areas, probably most prominently the economy, but also on foreign policy. I think the withdrawal from Afghanistan is a stain on the Biden administration that it was never able to shake. The subsequent Russian invasion of Ukraine, the subsequent total chaos in Gaza and the Middle East generally have not really inspired anyone to think the Democrats knew what they were doing on national security issues. Trump offered a clear alternative in that he talked about strength and he talked about the U.S. getting out of places where he didn't think our national interests really mattered that much. And I think those of us who support Ukraine in its war against Russia are going to have some tough days ahead as the president-elect sorts out what his policy is going to be in terms of negotiations for the end of that war. But I think overall, Morgan, this was a rejection of the status quo. And I think one of the big mistakes Kamala Harris made was campaigning with Liz Cheney and looking like she was unified with if for lack of a better term, I'm not saying I'm endorsing this, the globalists from the Republican Party uniting with the globalists from the Democratic Party did not help her at all. And that's a lesson for those of us who do care about the U.S. role in international affairs. Our job is not necessarily to find the like-minded people in the other party. We have to persuade the people in our party, and I'm speaking as a Republican, we have to persuade the people in our party that our approach makes sense and is in the U.S. national interest. That's been a tough sell for the last 20 years or so, and it's still a tough sell. And I think we need to look deep inside and think about the way we're talking across the different groups inside the party, and think about the best way forward that will allow for a robust U.S. role in the world while also getting support from the American people, from the voters, because we have not done that. And this is just a terrific example of that failure.
Yeah. So, Amy, I'm going to turn to you now. Les mentioned Afghanistan. I know that you had a very significant role on getting people out and really helping Afghans as well as, Americans to deal with the aftermath of this disastrous withdrawal. And I think it's important to note that traditionally Americans, at least the poll numbers indicate, for whatever it's worth, that Americans don't really care about foreign policy, right? It's the economy, stupid, right? So tell me, how do you think Afghanistan, how do you think foreign policy really played into these election results, and what does this mean for Americans moving into January?
Well, I think, Morgan, that, you know, it's somewhat a misnomer now that economic security and national security are two separate silos. The two are intricately uh, aligned at this point. And I think, starting with Afghanistan, it was a moment of weakness on the national stage for the US. Americans don't like to look weak. We don't like to lose. And I think it struck a chord in people saying, what is going on? This isn't who we are. And then it to be followed up by the invasion of Ukraine and now the war in the Middle East. It's this kind of domino effect that took place. And people looked at that and said, this isn't what America does. We're supposed to be a force for good. And they see money going to, through USAID for DEI, in, places around the world. And they're saying, what are we spending all this money for? And there's never been a clear strategy from this administration, Biden administration, on Ukraine, on the Middle East. It's just kind of continued to fester where we send money, we send planes, we send weapons, and there's been no end. And, you talk about, you look back 2 years ago, Jake Sullivan said, the Middle East has never been quieter. This is the first time in decades that the Middle East has been quiet. And then, a week later, the attack on Israel happens. So she came in to the election basically saying, I was the last person in the room with the president. I was the one helping to make these decisions. Well, people weren't happy about these decisions. And so I think this morning, a lot of, Western elites are, waking up going, oh my God, what is next? And I will just say that, Trump, as we know from the first administration, is somewhat unpredictable in foreign policy. And he becomes the deterrent. We have talked a lot over the last 4 years that America has lost its deterrence, whether it be in the Indo-Pacific, in Europe, in the Middle East. And he now takes that place for that essentially strategy where we don't know, what he'll do, what his thoughts are on some of these issues. And if we don't know, the leaders of these, kind of this new axis of evil definitely don't know. I mean, I think Iran this morning wakes up very, very scared.
Yep, no, I think it's a really good point, Amy. Martha, turn to you because you are our transatlanticist. When it comes to our allies and partners, particularly those in Europe, our NATO allies, um, the relationship between Donald Trump and NATO has been a rocky one, right? We're talking about, Donald Trump has often called on NATO allies to pay their fair share. Um, of course, NATO allies have an obligation to pay 2% of their GDP to their defense budget. Not all, very few, as a matter of fact, are actually doing so. So how do you see a 47 Trump administration dealing and working with NATO, and how do you think that's going to impact our role in that AOR, specifically with respect to Ukraine?
So I think, as Lester said, I think that there's we have a lot of nervous allies in Europe. Zelensky handled the press inquiries, I think, very deftly. He, essentially, talked about looking forward to a positive relationship with Trump. He met with Trump in September, which was a smart move on his part. I think, one thing with, if I could just focus on Ukraine for a moment, one thing that I think is interesting about a possible, the possibilities with regard to a Trump presidency in Ukraine, my sense is that one thing that the Trump folks would dislike is this kind of like stalemate, like sending a bunch of weapons, sending a lot of money in a stalemate that just never ends. So my sense is it's either going to be something that is game changing in terms of significantly more support for Ukraine and a more robust or just stronger support for Ukraine action against Russia, or pulling back. Something that's decisive and not in this just never-ending war, right? So I think that's really the mantra of this, the never-ending wars. That's what it comes down to with the Trump supporters. With regard to our allies, ironically, Trump has, in a weird way, been a boon to European defense spending, and along with Putin and Russia. Germany had their Zeitenwende after the invasion of Ukraine. I think it's a wake-up call for Europeans, again, about their own need to support themselves in terms of their defense posture and their defense spending. But I will say, this 2% hurdle for NATO allies is, it's like, it's more, to me, I care more about what they're spending on and also their attitudes. Like, they could spend on all sorts of things, but if they're going to say no to a transfer of weapons when they're needed by a partner like Ukraine, or slow roll those the movement of weapons to Ukrainians, for example, then that doesn't really help, even if they were spending 4% on their GDP on defense. But in any event, the other thing I worry about is, this talk about a trade war, tariffs, with the EU. And so not only is that not helpful to our allies, it also doesn't help Americans, because any tariff is essentially a tax on Americans.
Yep.
So look, I think there's going to be some unpredictability. I think we could see some surprises. A lot of it actually also depends, of course, as we all know, who goes into these roles, who will be Secretary of State. We also see, there's going to be there's movement already. We saw, like, the Republicans took the majority of the Senate. The Republicans have the majority in the House. Just because they're in the same political party does not mean they're going to rubber stamp everything the Trump administration does. So, a lot depends on who is in the key seats. Senate leadership is going to change. Mitch McConnell is, stepping down as leader for the Republicans. And, we're talking about, like, looking at people like John Thune as a possible replacement for him. And what will that mean when the Trump administration? And then Secretary of State, there's, a lot of talk about Rick Grinnell. There's talk about Robert O'Brien, Senator Haggerty. A lot of this is just kind of Washington, rumors, but at the end of the day, even if Trump is the commander in chief, these cabinet members are going to have a lot of say in what happens.
Les, you had something to add?
Morgan, I think one thought for our listeners going forward: in the first Trump term, he got by. He relied heavily on bluster and unpredictability. I think that's going to be a lot harder to do in his second term. And the thing that's really going to matter is the size of the defense budget. And if Republicans really do end up with control of the House, they have a historic opportunity to make a massive investment in defense spending, which frankly we need, given all of the threats in the world, because the standard bluster and unpredictability and transactional nature of Trump I don't think is going to be enough for the next 4 years. We need to make some real changes in our national security infrastructure, and there is an opportunity to do that in the next couple of years.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And one of the things that it's important to mention is that if Republicans do walk away with the White House, the Senate, and the House of Representatives, they will have no excuse for failure. Right now is the time to get to work and do the hard things. The Republicans, particularly on the House side, really botched the first year of the Congress with a ton of political infighting. It was completely unnecessary. They were able to get their act together, the second year, and really come out. If they're able to maintain control of the House, which I am cautiously optimistic that they will, there's going to be a lot of work to do here, and there will be no excuse for failure. I think the American public in particular will be unrelenting in the next election if Republicans don't deliver. When it comes to the Democrats, now is an opportunity for them for some self-reflection and really take a hard look at what they stand for, particularly with respect to foreign policy moving forward, just given how poorly we have seen these past 4 years play out overseas and what that has done to U.S. global leadership. So moving forward, both sides have a lot of work to do, needless to say.
And to that point, Morgan, I just wanted to say, I really hope that in this next administration, we see a very hard pivot back to the Indo-Pacific, where we are not having these, San Francisco summits and trying to talk things through. That there is, to Les's point about the budget, that there is a hard look that our biggest adversary is China. We need to start acting like that. We need to start developing a strategy globally to combat their influence that we keep seeing spread its tentacles around the world. So,
yeah, Amy, thank you for mentioning that. I have little doubt that the Indo-Pacific and U.S. competition with China are going to be a very hot topic moving forward.
yep.
So with that is a wrap. Thanks so much to Devlin Burning, Claude Jennings, and the NSI staff for their help in producing today's episode. Join us again on Friday, November 8th, for another episode of Fault Lines, the National Security Institute's podcast that gets you smart, fast on the national security and foreign policy debates shaking up America. Fault Lines is now on YouTube, so check out our channel for a video of our smiling faces. If you like what you heard or saw, be sure to rate, review, and subscribe.